Welcome to Lucerne, and it's a great honor of mine to introduce William Uricchio today. William Uricchio is Professor Emeritus of Comparative Media Studies at MIT, where he founded and led the MIT Open Dog Lab and was principal investigator of the co-creation studio. He's also Professor Emeritus of Comparative Media History at Utrecht University. He's a philosopher and media historian. His PhD was in the first years of non-fiction cinema, and he looked at it not so much from the beginning, as the beginning of a new medium, but as the culmination of earlier media practices. He was always interested in emerging media and how it influences the way we look and experience the world. William has received numerous awards for his work, including Guggenheim, Humboldt, and Fulbright Research Fellowships, the Berlin Prize, and the MacArthur Fellowship. His most recent book, co-authored with Katerina Sisek, is Collective Wisdom. We had Kat here last year. She was here online. And I think he will talk about that book as well. And I have watched quite a number of your talks on YouTube because I'm like that YouTube guy. And I noticed that you use the word "we" a lot. And so I was a bit confused because you use it in different contexts. Sometimes you use "we" as expressing the individuum, like you talk about yourself in "we," which is nice. And then you talk about "we" as part of a group, and "we" as part of humanity. And I found that super fascinating because I think that this is actually the angles that we have to look at things when you're in the scientific community. We have to use those three angles, and I think it's also something that everyone in society has to learn to look at the world from the perspective of we as the individual, from the perspective of the perspective of being a part in an organization, in an organ, and the perspective of being part of this bigger organism that could be called humanity or nature or the Holy Spirit or the big fat the big fat biological computer, as Adam Douglas talks about it in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So my great pleasure, and we're all here to learn from you. Thank you.
Florian, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. We, it's my pronoun. But I think it really is something special about our job. I mean, what one does at a university, what one does as a professor, profess, and it is always about observing the larger groups that we're in, giving it guidance. We're the antennae of the culture in a way, and yeah. I appreciate very much the opening comments from the dean. Yeah, the reduction of complexity, truth. Ruhrmann is spot on with that. And it's a crucial issue. It's been the issue, the defining issue for the documentary from the start. Very much bound up in the earliest notions of what even the media were, what photography was, what its relation to the world was, certainly with film as well. We know that it took a while for most media forms. They start usually in nonfiction and then figure out how the world takes form, how it's represented. There's a kind of truth claim there always, and then it kind of goes off and fiction becomes the business model. But anyway, we'll talk a bit about that today. The dean was also referencing students for whom trust has a very different weight, a very different valence today in a world where social media predominates. And I think that in a way goes to the heart of my comments today. There's a bit of a disjunction, a mismatch between the arbiters of truth, the institutions charged with vetting and articulating what those standards are, and the realities that are lived by our students, by the people that are using social media every day. Of course, the concerns with truth and facticity extend over to that domain. Endless congressional hearings in the US with social media, whatever. But there's a disjunction because the terms, the concepts of truth are very much familiar from the last 550 years of media forms. From the start of the book in around 1450 till now, there have been fundamental concerns about authenticity, fundamental concerns about attribution, sourcing. All kind of systems have been evolved over those 550 years to grapple with those, to deal with the notions of representation. Those are the same issues that are ported over to today's social media world, but actually there are other issues there that are kind of unaddressed, and that's what I'm going to try to talk about today a little bit. So first, a few words just to fill in what Florian said, give it a picture. Open Doc Lab, if you don't know it, it does a lot of stuff, has a lot of lectures. A ton of content is hidden behind, those upper words lead to hundreds of hours of videotapes of speakers that we've had over the last dozen or so years. So there's quite a bit of stuff happening there. There are some pretty good resources like DocuBase, which has a couple of hundred interactives. Unfortunately, with the collapse of Flash, a whole generation of interactives kind of stopped working. But there's still a ton of content there, and it's a very useful place. MIT, the bigger setting that I work in, is not really known for media. If you think of, at least in the American academic world, media would be University of Southern California or UCLA or New York University, maybe Wisconsin, but MIT, not exactly. And it's an interesting story because, in fact, the history of media at MIT is profound. Who knew that Technicolor came from MIT? MIT used to be called Tech, and that's the tech in Technicolor. Calbus and Company back in 1919. Norbert Wiener with cybernetics, so fundamental to our thinking today about sort of recursivity and feedbacks in the world of AI being the latest. Vannevar Bush's Memex machine. Brewster Kahle, the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine, is Brewster Kahle's thing. People obsessed with precision. Ricky Leacock with direct cinema, Doug Edgerton with stroboscopic photography, Amar Bose with Bose headsets for perfect sound reproduction. There's a really interesting set of histories there, none of them branded as media, all of them branded in some other discipline. But in the aggregate, it's a really fascinating place to be. One of the dilemmas, though, is that because MIT is so known for technology, when we started the lab, the Open Doc Lab, it was quickly assumed that it was about new tech. It's about cutting edge technology, where the computer hits the documentary, and of course that's part of the story. But it's also about what happens methodologically. It's also about how people use it, does this change people in any way? How to think about the new affordances of this on a social level. And that was the reason we started the co-creation studio. Because the Open Doc Lab, it just carried too many assumptions that it was all about the tech. And we wanted really to emphasize the human side of it, the creative side of it. And this book, the book that came out of it, reflects that focus. And because this book, it's a book about co-creation, not just with people and not just with institutions, but also with non-living systems, with AI systems or with biological systems. Kat Cizek and I and the 12 other authors that worked together on this book really tried hard to focus on the affordances of these new systems for equity and justice, as the subtitle puts it. But also tried to say that this is not a new thing. that co-creation actually was pretty much part of our system before the heavy industry of media in the late 19th century took over and became something that sent us information and sent us our fiction. Before that, it's a bit like a forest ecosystem. The big trees grew up and they kind of hid all the underbrush. But those practices are very much in place and alive in communities. So with this book, we tried to learn from those communities, learn about co-creation as it existed historically, but also as it exists in especially marginalized communities, and to see how today's technologies could help us push that forward. If you're interested in this book, it's free. I mean, not this exact heavy book, but the digital shadow of it is it's a little hard to find, but if you go to MIT Press's website, just look for that open access button and you can do a quick download. What you'll miss are the hidden NFTs in the cover, but yeah, that's... okay. Wait a minute, this is, yeah, okay. Canary in the coal mine. I don't know if this expression makes any sense here, but you know, in mining culture, to know if there was a shortage of oxygen, the canary was the poor victim. And I guess I would argue too that the documentary has played that role in our media systems, what I said briefly at the beginning. That from the start, the test of a medium's representational capacity has been its ability to somehow capture the world in some way. The truth of the world, the fact of the world. And I think if you go back and look, for example, at the earliest uses of photography, whether Daguerre or whether Fox Talbot, the attempts to sort of capture time, in this case through Muybridge, almost always the topics are something in the world that's real. There's not a fictional conceit. The use of these, the sort of test of a medium's capacity is in this correlation to the world. And that sort of makes documentaries something of an antennae system. It's the early one out there. If you think of film überhaupt, film from the start, I think I did an analysis of the copyright record. So before copyrights in the US, copyright of film starts in 1911, 1912. Before that, there was a paper print collection where you could protect your film as a series of photographs on paper, so long strips of paper, which is why we have a lot of stuff before 1912. Paper preserves better than celluloid. But if you do a content analysis of what was saved, what was put on paper before 1911, certainly before 1906, something like 86, 87% of what was protected was nonfiction. Images of streets, images of factory processes, images of famous people, kings and whatever. Predominantly nonfiction. And fiction starts to enter around the time, there's a whole confluence of issues, the rise of a new exhibition system, the shift in admission prices, blah, blah, blah. There's a ton of things that happen circa 1905, 1906 that shift the weight of production to something easy to reproduce, fiction, because documentary requires going somewhere, taking risks. But all to say, certainly the first decade of film is emphatically nonfiction. So we could just say right there, the film medium itself owes its very existence to nonfiction. The earliest color we have, of course, is part of that story. But even when it comes to things like sound, one among the first sound films in Germany was Melodie der Welt by Walter Ruckmann, and in Germany, in Russia, it was Enthusiasm about the Don Basin. Both of these clearly documentaries, but also the first ones to sort of experiment with sound in this setting. And I think it's always the same story. The corollary to the world is something we understand. If you engage in fiction, Harry Potter or something, you need to invent a world. We need to understand that this stick can make people float or can make people disappear. You have to inform the viewer of the fictional rule set. But in the real world, if your representation is of the real world, that's really not something that's necessary. And we see it too with the uses. If you look at the predominant use of cell phones, they're used to record family events, accidents, all the crazy stuff one sees. Of course there's a fictional tradition or a fictional practice that's emerged out of it. But in fact, this system of representation has been grounded in the real. So I guess all this to say that the work that's been happening here, obviously the work of interactive and immersive and generative systems in documentary are very much part of this tradition. The idea of experiment and laboratory is essential because that's what this is. This is the place where those experimentations over the representational capacities and the user practices occur, that some of which will be taken up by mainstream industry, some of which will be turned into a business model, but not the stuff we're doing. This necessarily is the experimental part. People try to make money, and of course that would be the Netflixes of the world, or maybe the Michael Moores of the world. If you look at the structures, the organizational structures of the nonfiction is used, it's kind of interesting. The very first stage is very much about just clips, pieces of time and space, the actualité, the wonderful, and apt French description of it, actualité. It's now, it's new, it's present. And basically there are two other systems that emerge, both in the mid-1920s. One is a story-based system, Flaherty's Moana. It's a classic Hollywood story. It's enacted. And the other is Walter Ruckmann's Berlin film, which is very much a kind of a thematic ordering. There's not much of a story. It's the story of morning till night. It's the story of a city in action. But it's a more thematic organization, a non-fictional, non-narrative organization. And really, that's been it until around 2004. The Enemy Within, I could have used that, maybe Björkia Mirthru's film about Chechnya, The Enemy Within, with another interactive from 2004. But 2004, something changed right around that period, where people could contribute, as in the case of Video Nation. The public could contribute the elements. Or where you as a user going to the website could pick and choose which elements to see, pick and choose which sequence to use them in. That's a big change from this much more kind of stable tradition that dominated from the start, that either went off in a narrative direction, a classic story direction, or into a more thematic, formal organizational. So it makes this period, and I guess one of the things I want to emphasize here is that one of the reasons I think our ethical systems have not kept up is because literally we're talking about the last 20 years. A big 550 years of a particular set of media practices based on stability, based on authenticity, based on attribution. And in the last 20 years, we've shifted to something where the user can rebuild the sequence. The user can contribute elements. The user has a very different relationship to the medium in this more recent period. And our systems, our institutions have not kept up. So, co-creation for me is really a central part of this. So we know that storytelling is a grand, glorious tradition. And as words I've been using so far, it's fixed, right? That the book in the teacher's hand is a text that 50 other or 5,000 other teachers could be holding at the same moment. There's a stability in that textual system. It's a one-to-many delivery system. And whether we're talking about film, or whether we're talking about broadcasting, or whether we're talking about the book, all of them share that center to periphery, one-to-many delivery system. Agency is clear. The agency is in the hands of the teller. It's not to reduce the audience to nothing, but basically they can take it or leave it. They can listen or they can block their ears. They can interpret as they please, but still their basic position is to listen to the teller. So this is a system that we've had forever. But so is the other system. And the other system here you might call it play. It's fluid, it's individualized for these kids, it's who knows what the text is, anyone playing pirates, you know, you don't know who's gonna live or who's gonna die after this encounter. And it's an interaction, it's a co-creation process between someone who's built the rules of the world, what it means to be a pirate, this table is the boat, you know, whatever the conceits are in this game, and the users who actually have to enact this and can deploy it in any number of ways. It's a pas de deux, it's a dance between two parties. The designer has agency, but the user has equivalent agency. Different, but equivalent. And that's quite a different story. So here we have a storyteller, there we have story finders. These kids are finding a story. They're improvising, and in the course of that improvisation, discovering and finding a story. So this system, it's an old system, obviously. There are hunters and gatherers who would spend their time in the woods looking around and finding stuff, and come back to the campfire and tell a story. So long term, both of these systems have coexisted. What's new now is that they're kind of mediated. I'm showing you like pretty much non-mediated forms. You take a tour bus through the city. Everyone hears the same story. Everyone takes the same path. It's a storyteller. But if you wander, you're a story finder. In education, most of us have probably learned with books. But in Canada, there was a system called jackdaws. And jackdaws would be a package of, if you're learning about the First World War, you get old money from that period, and you get some photos, and you get some maps, and you get some treaties, and you'd have to figure it out and put it together any way you could. Your job was to explore the artifacts of history, a bit like Lausanne's History Museum, where there's not a lot of context and there's not a lot of story. You figure it out. You connect the dots. So this, I know we're talking today about and not either or, but this kind of binary opposition between a highly structured event, one-to-many, authenticated, authored, and another system that's very much hard to pin down, nebulous, spontaneous. Authenticity is a problem. Figuring out precisely who is responsible is a problem. That's kind of where we are in terms of the world of interactive. As I was getting ready to come here, this was in the newspaper a couple of days ago, New York Times. A story about a museum in Detroit, a Holocaust museum, with a problem. And the problem is people taking selfies next to the Nazi uniforms. What do you do? Museums, if you think about them, are very much like a city where you can wander around. There's a high level of interactivity. Designers have constructed a space and provided information and shaped something. But you, the user, can go left or go right, skip it all together, read the text or not read the text. There's a huge amount of agency for the user. And what the solution these folks came up with is an interesting one. That's the old image where you could stand in front of the uniform and have your selfie taken or do your selfie. But the new one put a bunch of photos of Holocaust victims on it so that you can still see the uniform. So this is a great example of how this is this kind of imbrication with one another, this involvement with one another, where a designer can actually respond to the affordances of freedom that the user has, and not take away the freedom, but shape the experience a little bit more. And I think this is the space. This is the kind of experimentation, precisely the kind of experimentation that we're seeing in the domain of interactive and immersive and generative documentary. You try something and you see what worked and what didn't, and whoever's next on usually these are projects that iterate nonstop. There's not a final state. So this process of learning and redesigning, retweaking, retooling in this pas de deux between designer, environment designer, and user experience is a really, really important one. It's important because if you look at the penetration of these new technologies, This is a relatively recent story. The level of penetration is profound, and it's of relatively short duration. The numbers speak for themselves on a global level. This is not simply a first world issue. And the question is, what systems are in place, what protocols are in place to sort of help us understand how to work with users and not permit this system to be abused? Because I would argue we're seeing quite a bit of abuse right now by state agents, among others, right now in terms of disinformation campaigns. So we know from the imprimatur, now it tends to be associated with the Catholic Church, but in fact it was more widely used. This is an example from Britain, where the English licensing laws, the printing licensing laws, also had their own imprimatur. So the Principia Mathematica had a secular imprimatur. Imprimatur pops up pretty much coincident with the printing press. Like within 50 years, it's in place. Rome is trying to stabilize and authenticate this particular medium. So as I said probably a couple times already, it's so interesting to me that with emergent media forms, you see these attempts to kind of make clear what is the chain of attribution, what is the chain of authenticity, what's this thing's relationship to the real, whether the real is the real of numbers or the real of God or whatever people imagine the real to be. So these systems are robust and in place and taken for granted. For 550 years of this. And I think, so just trying to argue, we've had this very long tradition of doing things a certain way, like, I don't know how many generations 550 years is, but it's a lot of generations. And in the last 20, 25 years, we've slid into a new space and basically have tried to extend some of these systems, but they don't exactly work. I mean, it's important to ask questions about representation and whatever. We'll see in a minute. But that's the kind of dilemma I want to get to. Want to mention one other thing before jumping into the data. James Carey, really interesting, to my mind, really interesting thinker on media. And among the things, his wonderful stuff on telegraphy and whatever, but one of the things he talks about is that, generally speaking, if you were to go to a university with a communications department, the way they tend to talk about media is indeed using Shannon and Weaver's communication model. This is like out of engineering school. We have a message. We want to send a message from point A to point B, and it should get there cleanly and efficiently, and perhaps there's a little bit of noise, and we have to mitigate that noise. This is about getting it from A to B. What's misinformation? Someone has screwed with has introduced extra noise into the system. But it's this transmission model. And most of our thinking, most of our academic thinking about communication has been predicated on that model. And Carey says, actually, there's another dimension that's just as important, and it's called ritual. Now, he uses ritual in the sociological sense, going back to Durkheim, Emile Durkheim. But he said, for him, ritual is exchange, sharing, collaboration. So you might think of it, a newspaper is about transmission. It's researched and a good, well-written story. We read it, then what happens? You stand around and have coffee with your friends. I read this, you read that. That's the ritual part. That's where the knowledge is massaged into something more powerful, potentially. Technologically speaking, business-wise speaking, economics, the truth behind at least in our culture, what passes for the ultimate truth, things have happened in a really interesting way. In 2014, so pretty much 10 years ago, both WhatsApp and the Washington Post were sold. Jeff Bezos from Amazon bought the Washington Post, and Mark Zuckerberg from Meta bought WhatsApp. And Washington Post is, in terms of content, in terms of journalistic content, probably number 2 paper in the United States, clean, good, well-researched content. And the whole deal was $250 million. That included educational assets, television, whatever. The newspaper itself, about $80 million. That's what the value of the Washington Post was, a lot of money. WhatsApp, which was basically no content. It's a network framework. Just add email addresses or phone numbers or whatever. 19 billion. And I know they both sound like big numbers, but when I did the data visualization, this is what I got. It's like 80 million or 19 billion. It's dramatic, and it says something because the Washington Post is old school content. It's old school transmission. And WhatsApp is nothing except ritual. It's nothing except what we do with one another. We are the magic ingredient, and we send stuff around and back and forth. This is important because it is the driver behind the interactive systems we're using. They are about ritual. They are about that engagement, that give and take, that sharing. This is a language we'll come back to. Okay, one depressing slide, and then we're going to jump into the stuff. So we are at a moment where, from those previous slides I showed you, more than half, almost 2/3 of the world's population is using these interactive platforms, these digital platforms. And this is the moment where probably one of the most important producers of interactive documentaries, the National Film Board of Canada, a week or two ago decided to stop the to close the interactive unit. Sundance last year shut down it's part of the festival that was the laboratory part, New Frontier. That's strange. How can it be that at a moment where the usage of these technologies is reaching near saturation, that the people analyzing it and understanding it are stepping out of the business? And I think there are local answers in both cases, but I point to it as a kind of a warning that it's a lot of times, and I hear a lot, people expect, oh, you're going to make an interactive, like, let's think of, what's the money? Where's the money on this? I'm working with a museum in Australia on a huge immersive space, and it's all about, like, where's the money going to come from? These aren't necessarily experiments. This is where we learn what works and what doesn't and how to fine-tune it, not where we learn to make money. But somehow that message seems to get a bit garbled, and I think it results in problems like this. So I wanted to understand how it is, how people talk about trust, how people talk about ethics, how people talk about reliability in the media forms we're looking at. And to do that, I thought I would scan the organizations, because these discourses happen at an institutional level. I would scan a bunch of different organizations. So I looked at nonprofits, governments, the FCC. I didn't look at a lot of governments. I looked at the FCC primarily. Corporate governance. I looked at CNN, BBC, New York Times. Professional codes of ethics, the Online News Association, the Society of Professional Journalists, and then international groups like UNESCO and W3C. Consortium, the World Wide Web Consortium, to see how these folks talk about issues of reliability, authentication, trust. Because this is where it's both articulated collectively and where it's policed. One big problem in our sector is that journalism, and most of those are organizations that interface with journalists, journalism is fundamentally interested in facts, the correctness of facts. Whereas documentary is, I would say, primarily concerned with construction of truth. Facts do not equal truth. I can put together a collection of facts, but they yield something, but not necessarily the truth. And the truth does not necessarily have to be embedded in fact, or at least articulated through fact. So for all the documentaries that use animation as their form, yeah, it doesn't need to be a photograph. And anyway, what's the truth status of a photograph? But all to say, these are kind of two, it's a Venn diagram, there's some overlap. The overlap would be sectors like journalistically, documentaries that exist in a journalistic setting. Probably the most important television series in the US is Frontline, and Frontline is the documentarians there hew to journalistic fact-checking standards. Everything is fact-checked. That's not to say true, it's just to say it's factually correct. So the fact part is always a lot easier to sort of document and pin down than the truth part, because truths are a little more elusive. And so it is that most of these organizations are concerned with fact and with attribution. So I'm saying this as a kind of critique of my method. I'm not likely to find a whole lot of truth discourse, although people appeal to the truth here. But in a way there's a bias to my selection process. Okay. And so anyway, went through just like what are the key terms? What key phrases do people use? What's the and it's stuff like this. If you want to see how media ethics are imagined by this array of organizations, what you get are, predictable stuff. You get concern about data security, transparency, accuracy, some interesting, like, timely ones. How have these people kept up with the time? Oh yeah, it's about inclusivity and diversity, or it's about environmental impact. Those are timely. Cultural sensitivity, timely. That's how it's kept up. But really it's ultimately about kind of representation, agency, about articulation of agency, transparency, and that sort of stuff, naturally, regulatory compliance. So let's press this a little bit to get something closer to our space. What about digital media in particular? Like, are the issues different? And here it's misinformation, filter bubbles, the buzzwords that you kind of probably have picked up in the press a lot: privacy, harassment, deepfakes, gamification, digital divide, platformization. So all very worthy issues. But are these the issues? I mean, and I know we're in a space of makers here. Are these the issues? Of course these are issues that touch the work you're doing. But it seems to me there are very clear issues that are not being discussed here that touch upon precisely interactive and immersive and user-generated content systems and generative AI systems. So let's just jump over to that. This is an example of one of the big problems with interactive, and it's decontextualization. On the one hand, we want to give the user agency. We want them to make choices. We want them to decide to follow their interest inside the environment of resources we've provided. We build an interface that allows users to go here, there, and everywhere. This is a project called Visualizing Cultures. It was actually a kind of a course. It's pretty old one, you can see 2005, 2006. And what happened was, this was about the visualization of, was basically a project about Japanese-Western relations. And in the course of all these artifacts, images, from over 500 or 600 years, how the Japanese imagined the West and how the West imagined the Japanese. In the course of that, there are some images about Japanese, in this case, it's a Japanese atrocity in China. The Japanese killed a lot of Chinese people. And the point of the thing was that the Japanese portrayed themselves as Western, in Western uniform. So this was a Japanese claim, not just to military superiority, but to military superiority that translated well to the West. That's the purpose, and it's in a context that's very, very critical of this event. And someone in China got hold of this and plucked the image and said, MIT celebrates the death of Chinese. MIT, Japanese imperialists at MIT celebrate and savor the death of the Chinese. And within a day, MIT servers, they have really robust servers and robust protection, were flattened. The university system just collapsed. So much stuff came in from China. You can see here the response of the university, the chancellor, the professors involved, including a Pulitzer Prize winner, John Dower, the president, the faculty, all issued statements like, no, this is not our intent. This is a really good example of the dangers. Now think of this, the interactives, I've cut my teeth on them, I love them, I work with them every day. At a moment of epistemological crisis, where we are today, where forget ideology. These are people today argue about Did Trump win the election or did Biden? And half the Americans are split on that. Like, there's clear fact, there's 60 court cases. No. It's all a lie, Trump won. Like, when you live in a moment of this kind of breakdown in basic epistemology, like the early modern era, you have alchemy and you have chemistry coexisting at the same moment. Like, which of these paradigms are you going to engage in? What do you do with interactive, where people can recontextualize, decontextualize? It's a fraud system. And so that learning from, for example, museum designers who I think did a great job, a way to think about this. But anyway, because documentary is primarily imagined, at least in the theoretical world, as rhetoric, it's a rhetorical, documentary is about a rhetorical claim of one kind or another. It's rhetoric. Rhetoric, argument requires structure. And if you can fool around with that structure, is that antithetical? Does that make interactive a non-documentary necessarily? Or does it allow engagement and involvement and personalization, all the things we know it can do? It can't do the same thing as an old school linear documentary, but it can do some wonderful other things. But how do we keep it reasonable and safe? That strikes me as a core ethical question that has to do with the very structure of what we work with, where experimentation is the answer. What do we do with user-generated stuff? I see change as a brilliant user-generated, it's on climate change. And it gathers data that's too fine-grained for any scientific organization to gather. It would cost them all the money in the world to gather this stuff. People contribute to this, they contribute happily. It's extraordinarily useful. But what do we do with these systems? I mean, on the one hand, we've got the problem of exploitation. Okay, this is not Mark Zuckerberg and it's not making a fortune on the backs of its users, but that is an issue. And the other issue is, what do you do with credibility and trust? What do you do with that content? How can you certainly no journalistic documentary could use this kind of material because it can't be vetted. And yet it's incredibly valuable. So again, this is a great domain to sort of raise that question. How do we think about coming up with systems, coming up with ways to think about ethics? Now, you're going to hear in everything I'm saying the punchline, which is going to be, well, gee, the user, we've never talked about the user before. We've talked about the user as, maybe let's not abuse them and whatever, but hey, the user has some responsibility in this. What about that ethical dimension? That doesn't pop up anywhere. It's all about, it's coming from that old school notion of we to them, center to periphery. Immersive systems have their own affordances, but also their own dangers. Jeremy Bailenson writes eloquently about post-traumatic stress syndrome and how VR can be the cure, and if that's accurate, and if the causal, there's some of you have probably heard of media effects theory, right? This notion that media cause things to happen. It was a big theory in the propaganda days of World War II, kind of started to fade away in the 50s and 60s when uses and gratifications, idea that people used media for their own ends came about. This is back to the days of the kind of very mechanical thinking of media, that it causes things to happen. We can cure this problem or that problem, like putting you in a VR headset. We can sell you Coca-Cola more than ever if you put on the headset. So if that is accurate, then it makes one wonder, like, what about the kind of game world of VR where people are killing people left, right, and center? If desensitization is the outcome, then you're desensitizing people to some pretty heavy stuff. And if desensitization is not the outcome, then you've got the other problem of trauma. You're re-traumatizing people. So we've been working, for example, with some Holocaust VR makers. It's like, how do you even imagine representing the Holocaust for people that might have been victims or whose family members were victims without causing emotional damage? Like, how do you even step into that space? That's a key issue that doesn't pop up anywhere in those ethical concerns coming from the major media watch organizations. So again, just to say that the specific forms we're working with raise questions that are simply not on the charts of the organizations doing the policing. And why? Because those organizations are still living like it's the year 2000, and we've moved into a new space. And last but not least, we have, take your pick of deepfake apps. Generative AI is a space we're just entering. Fortunately, because it is perceived by our cultural arbiters to be dangerous, there's a lot of energy in this space, a lot of thought going into it, tons of uncertainty, and mostly deferral. I was talking to Florian last night. Feuerbach comes to mind, where Marx takes up Feuerbach's ideas of that man has, what's God? God is man taking all of the best parts of man, kindness and mercy, or terror and fear, whatever your good God happens to be, and like projecting them up in the sky, relieving us of the burden of being kind and generous, and waiting for the person in the clouds to make it all happen. And that's a little bit how we deal with AI. All those attributes of us that we wish we had or know we had, we defer it to AI and then get a little bit panicked about it. But anyway, that's another story. There's some responses to this. So this is a white paper we did with, my lab did together with Witness, which is pretty much the mantra here is prepare, don't panic. And it's looking, let's not try to police it. It's not about policing AI, and it's not about, or deepfake, it's not about outlawing it or whatever. It's about finding appropriate uses for it. Satire, for example. Like, let's find some creative use to this stuff so that there's an education curve that occurs as people embrace it, but they embrace it understanding its capacities, for example, for satire, as opposed to the Donald Trump just joking retort. Or I see that Leica has come up with attempting to reinvent the index. So here's a system that there's a consortium of companies, this thing at the bottom, the Content Authenticity Initiative. It's the New York Times, Twitter, old Twitter, before Twitter was X. I don't think Musk would support this initiative anymore. Leica. A handful of companies have gotten together at the BBC to try to figure out a way to embed authenticity and attribution inside AI-generated work. And this new Leica camera has that hardwired in it. So here we're seeing some steps to sort of mitigate the damage, but there's still a ton of ethical issues surrounding, obviously deepfake being crucial. The Taylor Swift stories in the past few days of the New York Times have been central among those. So what's holding us back? And I think, so by and large, the marginalization of our sector is part of it. These are not the burning issues for most of the institutions on the chart. But the institutions even acknowledge that the speed of technological development means they can't keep up, can't possibly keep up. Moore's law is still in force, despite every prediction that it shouldn't be. Business models, so platforms, for example, 10 years ago, where were the platforms? Like, this is a radical shift in how we're imagining financial models. And not just media content, but financial models and even modes of social organization through platforms. The jurisdictional stuff, these are global forms, so what's the jurisdiction? There's not really, you can make any law you want in Switzerland, but it really doesn't matter. Maybe China's the exception, but it really doesn't matter because this stuff slips over borders. Ditto cultural variation. If you start to control things based on cultural sensitivities, by the time you cover the planet, like, there's not a lot left to say. Competing stakeholders, which of course is a standard one. The interdisciplinarity, which discursive domain do you even use? Is this a tech problem? Is it a legal problem, social problem? Education awareness, enforcement mechanisms, yeah, that's a big deal. And the biggest issue, how do you balance freedom with regulation? How do you give the user the space to explore and co-create, and at the same time impose a sense of responsibility? So to wind down, I just want to call attention to what I think in the world of experimentation and research in our sector, the missing link, the thing that we have not spent enough time talking about, is the user. the user, to the extent that agency of the user has been increased, to that extent there's a growth in responsibility. And how do we talk about that? Nothing I've seen in the scan of the whole field's discussion of ethics talks about like the responsibility of the user. That's just a non-issue. Or if it showed up once and it was sort of like people giving content away, using the same Netflix account for multiple parties. Like, oh, that's where you need to think about the user. They're exploiting, they're breaking the economic system. But actually, to the extent that we're talking about interaction, to the extent that we're talking about co-creation, what do we do with that other co-creator? Because all of us tend to think of it from the maker side. But what about the user side? And how might we approach that? And I don't have an answer. But I want to make this a clear call out to put this on the research agenda. Because without it, we're sunk. Without it, it becomes an endless sort of Sisyphusian design challenge to constantly find ways to game the user and keep them in their place. So is this about thinking about labeling, like, oh, Arte did it, New York Times did it, or Die Zeit, or Arte, where you have a responsible vetter that's kind of bearing the weight of authenticity and trust and all that. That's a way to go. Although one of the biggest NFB has just pulled the plug on it. Is this about a new viewing attitude? At least with the AI stuff, we've been trying to push that. Like, prepare, think about it. Don't panic, don't freak out, don't not use it or don't overuse it, but approach this with a semblance of wisdom. Can we come up with new tactics, new technologies? Like the Leica system. Okay, that certainly seems to work in that setting for now. Maybe there's some way to watermark or whatever, like there are certainly some solutions in that space. If you were to ask me, the issues of media literacy are the most fundamental. Like working with the people that are using these systems to be critical users, to think about not just critical in terms of discerning truth from fiction, but critical in the sense of being a partner in that process, a player in that process. That's really the gist of what I think is important here. So a co-creation scenario requires, has multiple parties, and those multiple parties have to be at the same table and have to be thinking about the same notions of trust and responsibility. So I think with that I will shut up and take any questions. Yeah, thank you.